Dawn breaks over the Somme Valley on September 15, 1916, revealing a landscape torn apart by years of relentless artillery fire. A thick mist clings to the churned earth of no man's land, masking the horrors of the trenches and the decaying bodies of the fallen. German sentries peer nervously into the gloom, expecting another wave of infantry to be mowed down by their machine guns. Instead, a low mechanical rumble begins to vibrate through the ground, shaking the mud beneath their boots. Out of the fog emerges a shape unlike anything ever seen in warfare before that day. It is a steel lozenge crawling relentlessly over craters and barbed wire crushing defenses with terrifying ease. The soldiers freeze in disbelief as the iron monster looms closer, firing its cannons into their fortified positions. This was the debut of the tank, a secret weapon designed to break the bloody stalemate of the Western Front and change the course of history. Inside the cramping metal hull, a crew of 8 men choked on exhaust fumes and cordite smoke, while the engine roared deafeningly in their ears. The heat was unbearable, often rising to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the interior into a steel oven. Bullets hammered against the outer plating, creating a terrifying cacophony that threatened to drive the men mad. Despite the mechanical failures and the sheer physical exhaustion, the crew drove their machine forward. They were pioneers in a new form of combat that would forever change the nature of military history and strategy. To understand the arrival of this steel beast, we must look back at the desperate state of the war 2 years prior. By late 1914, the mobile phase of the conflict had ended, and the opposing armies had dug in from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The trench lines were fortified with layers of barbed wire that were almost impossible for infantry to cut through under fire. Machine gun nests commanded every angle of approach, turning the open ground into a killing zone. Generals launched massive assaults, sending thousands of men over the top, only to see them slaughtered within minutes. The war had become a meat grinder, consuming a generation of young men with no significant gain in territory. Casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, and the morale of the troops was beginning to fracture under the strain of futile offensives. The traditional methods of warfare involving cavalry charges and massed infantry were rendered obsolete by modern industrial weaponry. Artillery barrages could churn up the ground, but they could not destroy the deep dugouts or cut all the wire. A solution was needed that could cross the fire-swept zone of no man's land without succumbing to the hail of bullets. The military leadership was desperate for an answer, but they were often slow to embrace new technology. It would take a few visionaries to push for a mechanical solution to a tactical problem that seemed unsolvable. One of these visionaries was a British Army officer named Ernest Swinton, who had observed the carnage early in the war. Swinton had seen American-made Holt Caterpillar tractors towing heavy artillery behind the lines and wondered if they could be adapted for combat. He envisioned an armored vehicle climbing over trenches and crushing barbed wire while protecting the crew inside from small arms fire. It was a radical concept that combined the mobility of the tractor with the protection of a warship. Swinton wrote a memorandum proposing the idea of a machine gun destroyer to the high command. He believed that such a machine could lead the infantry across the deadly space between the trenches and restore movement to the battlefield. However, the road to development was blocked by skepticism and bureaucracy within the traditional military establishment. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, dismissed the idea, calling the proposed machines pretty mechanical toys. Many senior officers believed that the war would be won by artillery and grit rather than unproven gadgets. They argued that the terrain was too rough for vehicles and that the mechanical reliability would be a constant issue. Swinton faced rejection after rejection, but he refused to let the idea die. He knew that the current strategy was failing and that a mechanical breakthrough was the only way to save lives. He needed a powerful political ally to bypass the conservative army leadership. That ally appeared in the form of Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty. Although the tank was intended for land warfare, it was the Navy that took up the project under his direction. Churchill saw the potential in the idea and formed the Landships Committee in February 1915 to investigate the possibility of armored vehicles. He operated with a level of secrecy and urgency that the Army lacked, diverting Navy funds to the experiments. Churchill was known for his interest in new technologies and his willingness to take risks. Without his intervention and political weight, the tank might never have moved beyond the concept stage during the war. The engineering challenge facing the Landships Committee was immense and required solving problems that had never been encountered before. The vehicle needed to be able to cross a trench that was 8 feet wide and climb a parapet 4 feet high. It had to carry heavy armor, weaponry, and a crew while traversing soft mud that would swallow a normal truck. Early experiments with existing tractor chassis failed because they were too short to cross wide trenches without getting stuck. The engineers realized they needed a completely new design with a longer track length. They worked tirelessly in workshops, testing various configurations of wheels and tracks, attempting to find the perfect balance between mobility and protection. The task of designing this new machine fell to William Triton of the Agricultural Machinery Company, William Foster and Company, and naval officer Walter Wilson. Triton was an expert in agricultural engines, while Wilson was a brilliant engineer with a sharp mind for mechanics. They worked out of a factory in Lincoln, England under strict security measures to prevent German spies from learning of the project. The pressure was intense as the war continued to claim thousands of lives every day. They sketched designs on the factory floor and worked late into the night. Their collaboration would result in a machine that looked like nothing else on Earth, a true product of industrial warfare. Their first prototype was completed in the autumn of 1915 and was named Little Willie. It featured a box-like hull and a trailing pair of wheels intended to help with steering. While it demonstrated the potential of the track system, it fell short of the Army requirements for trench crossing. The tracks were too flat, and the center of gravity was too low, causing it to get high-centered on obstacles. Little Willie was a disappointment in terms of combat readiness, but it was a crucial stepping stone in the learning process. Triton and Wilson analyzed the failures and immediately began working on a second design that would solve the problems of the first. The breakthrough came with a radical redesign of the track system that gave the tank its iconic shape. Instead of tracks running under the vehicle, they ran around the entire perimeter of a large rhomboid-shaped frame. This design allowed the tracks to grip the ground at a steep angle, enabling the machine to climb high vertical banks. This new machine was known as Big Willie or Mother, and it met all the requirements set by the Army. It did not have a turret because the center of gravity would be too high, so guns were mounted in sponsons on the sides. This was the birth of the classic World War I tank silhouette. Security was paramount during the construction and testing phases to ensure the element of surprise. Factory workers were told that they were building mobile water carriers for the British Army in Mesopotamia. The term water tank was used in documents and conversation to disguise the true nature of the steel hulls. Eventually, the name was shortened to simply tank, a word that was meaningless enough to avoid suspicion. The name stuck and became the official designation for the armored fighting vehicle. This deception was so successful that even the soldiers who would eventually crew them had little idea what they were volunteering for until they arrived at the training grounds. The men recruited for this new branch of the service were a mix of motor mechanics and artillerymen. They were sent to a secret training ground at Elvedon in Suffolk, which was sealed off from the public. The training was rigorous and focused on maintenance as much as driving because the machines were incredibly unreliable. Crews learned to communicate using hand signals because the noise of the engine made speech impossible. They practiced driving over simulated trench lines and firing their weapons while on the move. The bond between the crew members was vital as they would be locked together in a dark, noisy box in the middle of a battlefield. By August 1915, the first production models known as the Mark I were ready for shipment to France. They were divided into two types based on their armament, with the cannon-armed versions called males and the machine gun-armed versions called females. The anticipation among the crews was a mixture of excitement and dread as they prepared to cross the Channel. They knew they were carrying a weapon that could end the war, but they also knew they would be prime targets. The tanks were covered in tarpaulins and moved at night to keep them hidden from enemy reconnaissance aircraft. The secret was about to be unleashed. The British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig was planning a massive offensive on the Somme and was eager to use every available weapon. The inventors and the tank commanders pleaded for more time to fix mechanical bugs and train the crews. They argued that using the tanks prematurely in small numbers would waste the element of surprise. Haig, however, was under immense pressure to deliver a victory and refused to wait for mass production. He ordered the tanks to be deployed as soon as they arrived in France. This decision would remain controversial, as many historians argue it blunted the strategic impact of the new weapon. As the day of the attack approached, the mechanical fragility of the Mark I became painfully apparent. Of the 49 tanks that were shipped to the front, only 32 made it to the start line. The others broke down or got bogged in the mud before they could even engage the enemy. The engines were underpowered for the immense weight of the armor, and the tracks were prone to snapping. The crews worked frantically through the night to repair their machines, often using sledgehammers and brute force. Despite these setbacks, the order to attack remained in place, and the crews climbed into their steel beasts. At dawn on September 15th, the roar of engines signaled the beginning of the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. One tank, commanded by Captain H.W. Mortimer, moved ahead of the infantry and engaged the German defenders. This was the first time in history that a tank had entered combat, and the effect was immediate. As the tank loomed out of the mist, the German soldiers were paralyzed with fear. Their bullets bounced harmlessly off the steel hide, and their machine guns were silenced by the tank's return fire. The psychological impact was far greater than the physical damage caused by the guns. Reports from the German lines described a panic that spread rapidly through the ranks as the monsters advanced. Soldiers who had stood firm against artillery and gas attacks broke and ran at the sight of the tanks. They had no anti-tank weapons and no training on how to deal with armored vehicles. The cry of the devil is coming echoed through the trenches as the tanks rolled over the barbed wire. For a brief moment, the German defense collapsed in the face of the unknown. It was a terrifying realization that the rules of war had changed, and they were defenseless against this new technology. However, the success was not universal, and the limitations of the Mark I were quickly exposed in the chaos. Many tanks became stuck in the deep shell craters that littered the battlefield and could not pull themselves out. Others suffered mechanical failures and were abandoned by their crews, who then fought as infantry. Communication between the tanks and the infantry broke down, leading to confusion and friendly fire incidents. Despite these failures, the tanks that kept moving were able to advance deeper into enemy territory than any previous assault. They captured the village of Flers and proved that the concept of the tank was sound. The news of the new weapon reached Britain and was seized upon by the press as a great victory. Newspapers published illustrations of the tanks crushing German soldiers and hailed them as the wonder weapon that would win the war. The propaganda value was immense, giving the public a much-needed morale boost after the horrific casualties of the Somme. The tank became a symbol of British ingenuity and industrial power. War bonds were sold using the image of the tank, and toy models began to appear in shops. The secret was out, and the tank had become a national icon. The German High Command initially made a critical strategic error by dismissing the tank as a failure. They looked at the high breakdown rate and the limited terrain gained and decided it was not worth copying. They believed that armor-piercing bullets and field artillery would be enough to counter the threat. This delay in developing their own tank program would cost them dearly in the later stages of the war. Instead of building their own fleet, they focused on developing anti-tank tactics and rifles. It was a miscalculation that underestimated the rapid rate of technological improvement that the British were achieving. The British engineers were already hard at work improving the design based on the lessons learned at the Somme. The Mark IV tank, introduced in 1917, featured thicker armor and a more reliable fuel supply system. The cumbersome tail wheels, which had proved useless in combat, were removed, making the tank more compact. The Lewis guns were replaced with more effective weaponry, and the escape hatches were redesigned. These improvements made the Mark IV a much more formidable machine than its predecessor. The tank was evolving from a clumsy prototype into a reliable weapon of war. The next major test for the tank corps came at the Battle of Arras and the disastrous assault at Bullecourt. Here the tanks were forced to attack over snow-covered ground without a preliminary artillery bombardment. The Australian infantry they were supporting suffered heavy casualties when the tanks broke down or arrived late. The trust between the infantry and the tanks was damaged, and many soldiers grew resentful of the machines. It became clear that tanks could not win battles alone and required close coordination with artillery and foot soldiers. The tactics had to evolve alongside the technology. It was not until November 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, that the true potential of the tank was realized. The plan was championed by brilliant tacticians like J.F.C. Fuller and executed by General Huelles. They gathered nearly 476 tanks for a mass attack on the Hindenburg Line. The ground at Cambrai was dry and chalky, making it ideal for tank movement, unlike the mud of Flanders. The attack would rely on surprise, without a long artillery bombardment to warn the enemy. It was an all-or-nothing gamble to prove the worth of the tank corps. General Huelles, the commander of the tank corps, chose to lead the attack from the front in a tank named Hilda. He famously flew the tank corps flag from his vehicle as he drove into battle. This act of bravery inspired his men and set a tone of aggressive leadership. The tanks carried huge bundles of wood called fascines on their roofs to drop into the wide German trenches. This allowed them to create their own bridges and cross the formidable defenses of the Hindenburg Line. The scale of the operation was unprecedented and marked the first true combined arms offensive. As the tanks rolled forward at dawn, they crushed the barbed wire and silenced the machine gun posts with devastating efficiency. The German defenders were overwhelmed by the sheer number of armored vehicles and surrendered in droves. The British forces advanced up to 5 miles in a single day, a feat that had taken months to achieve in previous battles. In London, church bells were rung to celebrate the victory, the first time they had been heard since the war began. It seemed that the deadlock of trench warfare had finally been broken by the steel monsters. However, the victory at Cambrai was short-lived, as the Germans launched a massive counterattack a few weeks later. The tanks had advanced too far ahead of their supply lines, and the infantry could not hold the captured ground. The Germans used stormtrooper tactics to infiltrate the British lines and retake the lost territory. Many tanks were knocked out by field artillery firing over open sights. The battle showed that while tanks could break the line, they needed infantry to hold it. It was a harsh lesson in the complexities of modern warfare. By 1918, the Germans had finally developed a tank of their own, the A7V. In April of that year, the first tank versus tank battle in history took place at Villers-Bretonneux. 3 British Mark IV tanks encountered 3 German A7Vs in a chaotic engagement. The British mail tank used its cannons to knock out the leading German tank, forcing the others to retreat. It was a skirmish rather than a major battle, but it signaled the future of armored warfare. The era of the tank fighting only infantry was over. The German A7V was a monstrous machine that looked like a moving fortress, but it was deeply flawed. It was boxy and top-heavy, with a crew of at least 18 men packed inside. Its suspension was poor, and it struggled to cross rough terrain that the British tanks could handle easily. Germany only produced 20 of these machines during the war compared to the thousands built by the Allies. The A7V was a symbol of German engineering capability, but also of their lack of resources and late start. It was too little too late to change the outcome of the war. While the British focused on heavy breakthrough tanks, the French developed a revolutionary design known as the Renault FT. This light tank was small, fast, and featured a fully rotating turret on top. The turret allowed the gunner to fire in any direction without turning the entire vehicle, a standard feature of all modern tanks. The Renault FT was designed to be used in swarms, overwhelming the enemy with numbers and speed. It was a masterpiece of design that complemented the heavy British tanks perfectly. The Allies now had a diverse range of armored vehicles for different tactical roles. The final year of the war saw the Allies utilizing tanks in a coordinated strategy known as the All-Arms Battle. At the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, hundreds of tanks attacked in unison with aircraft and artillery. The new Mark V tanks were faster and easier to drive, allowing them to keep pace with the advancing infantry. The Whippet tanks, which were lighter and faster, raced into the German rear areas, causing chaos. The German army was unable to form a cohesive defense against this mobile onslaught. The static trench warfare was finally transitioning into a war of movement. General Erich Ludendorff, the German commander, called the Battle of Amiens the Black Day of the German army. He cited the psychological effect of the tanks as a primary reason for the collapse of German morale. Soldiers who had fought bravely for 4 years were now surrendering at the sight of the Allied armor. The belief in victory had been shattered by the relentless advance of the machines. The tank had proven itself not just as a physical weapon, but as a psychological one. It broke the will of the enemy to fight. As the war drew to a close in November 1918, the tank had established itself as an essential component of modern military power. From the clumsy failures of the Somme to the decisive victories of 1918, the technology had matured at an incredible rate. The skeptics who had called them mechanical toys were silenced by the undeniable evidence of the battlefield. The tank had saved thousands of lives by taking the brunt of the machine gun fire. It had restored mobility to a war that had been frozen in mud and blood. The legacy of the World War I tank extends far beyond the battlefields of France and Belgium. It marked the birth of mechanized warfare and the end of the cavalry era. The principles of armored tactics developed during the war would be refined and used with devastating effect in the next global conflict. The rhomboid shapes of the Mark series and the turret of the Renault FT are the ancestors of every main battle tank in service today. They were the steel pioneers that paved the way for the future of combat. Today, the few surviving examples of these steel monsters sit in museums as silent witnesses to the birth of a new age. They are reminders of the ingenuity and courage of the men who designed, built, and fought in them. From a sketch on a factory floor to the dominant force on the battlefield, the tank changed the world. The Whisper of Time tells the story of how a concept became a conqueror in the mud of the Great War. The tank remains one of the most significant military inventions in human history.